Hello, hockey fans. This is Mark Willand. Before we begin the show, just a reminder that the Pro Hockey Alumni podcast supports the Warrior for Life Fund charity. If you follow social media, you saw a recent alumni weekend series between the Boston Bruins and New York Ranger legends to benefit the Warrior for Life Fund and the Navy SEALs Foundation. Through the game of hockey, the Warrior for Life Fund provides programs and infrastructure that helps military families cope with the unique challenges of combat, extended deployments, and disabilities. The Warrior for Life Fund will memorialize the history and heritage of military service and honor those who have unselfishly given the ultimate sacrifice. We are proud to be associated with these real-life heroes. To learn more, please visit warriorforlifefund.org. Thank you.
And now, ladies and gentlemen, boys and girls, a special hello goes out to the Director of Media for the Boston Bruins alumni, Mr. Mark Willand. Nice to see you, Marky.
Welcome to the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast, the voice of hockey legends. This is the classic hockey show for classic hockey fans. We celebrate the history of the game with stories told by the select few who actually lived it. Get ready for an all-access pass to the heart of the hockey universe. Episode 54 of the Pro Hockey Alumni Podcast features part one of our two-part discussion with Gary Suitcase Smith, one of the NHL's premier goaltenders and most fascinating characters of the 1960s and 70s. In this episode, Gary gives us amazing and humorous insights into his first two big league stops in Oakland and Toronto, as well as his junior career with the Toronto Marlboros. Also known as Axe for his stick-wielding ways, Gary was the co-winner of the Vezina Trophy in 71-72 with Chicago and NHL All Star in 1975 with Vancouver, and an AVCO Cup champion with the Winnipeg Jets in 1979. In addition to his on-ice accomplishments, Gary is remembered as a fun-loving and colorful netminder who is popular with teammates and fans alike. If you love classic hockey, you'll love this discussion with Gary Smith. Remember, home base for the show is prohockeyalumni.org, and you can also reach us anywhere on social media at Pro Hockey Alumni. Your comments, ratings, and reviews on iTunes are extremely valuable in increasing the visibility of the show. I read all your comments, and they are greatly appreciated. Now, let's talk classic hockey with Gary Smith. We're back on the show with a Memorial Cup Championship goaltender, an AVCO Cup champion, and an NHL All Star, Gary Smith. You can call him Suitcase, you call him Axe, but in either case, one of the most entertaining and durable hockey goaltenders of the 60s, 70s, and 80s. Gary, thanks so much for being with us today.
Pleasure, Mark. Nice to talk with you.
Well, we're looking forward to it. And what some people, our fans, may not know is that you come from a prominent hockey family. Your father, Des Smith, of course, played in the National Hockey League, was a part of a Boston Bruins Stanley Cup championship team in the 40s with Milt Schmidt, among others. Your brother Brian, of course, played for Minnesota and LA in the NHL and for the Houston Aeros in the World Hockey Association. So what's it like for a young man growing up in Ontario with your dad playing in the National Hockey League?
Well, when I grew my dad played in the National Hockey League before I was born. I was born in 44, which is a long time ago, but they won a Stanley Cup in 39-40, I think it was, for Boston. Mm-hmm. And then the war came, and everybody went to the war, and when the war was over, he came back and he was a linesman in the American Hockey League. So when I was growing up, he was a linesman and a referee also. in the American Hockey League, and I can remember going down to Syracuse, which is about 100 miles from Ottawa, where I grew up, to watch my dad ref and see him during the year, because I didn't see him that much at home in those days. I was very young, but I do remember a few things about it. And later on, when I was growing up, 8, 9, 10 years old, my dad was involved with the Ottawa Old Pros, and they were old timers hockey team. They played a lot of Montreal Old Pros and teams like that. I can remember one time, I was a big hockey fan, of course, when you're a kid, like everybody in Canada and northern United States. And I can remember one time my dad was sleeping in the morning, and the phone rang, and I answered the phone, and the guy said, "Is Des there?" And I said, "Who's calling, please?" Because I knew not to wake up my dad unless it was an important call. And he said, "Toe Blake, who is the coach of the Montreal Canadiens." And so I said, "Wow, Toe Blake." And so I ran upstairs and I talked to my dad. I said, "Toe Blake's on the phone, Dad." And so he said, "Okay," and he got up and he started talking to him. So he was talking, it was when Rocket Richard was suspended. He hit a referee or a linesman at one point, and they suspended him near the end of the year. And Montreal Old Pros were playing against Ottawa Old Pros, and my dad had called Toe and asked him if he could ask the Rocket if he would come up for the Old Timers game in Ottawa. It was played at the old Ottawa Auditorium, which held about 7,000 people, and they had sold about 100 tickets a week before. And so he was calling my dad back to tell him that the Rocket said he could play. He could come up and play, and this was when the Rocket was at his highest. He was like leading scorer in the team and most popular player in the world, and he was coming up to Ottawa. So my dad got dressed and came downstairs. He said, "Come on with me." And we went down to the auditorium, and he called some friends first, and we had to go pick up some money. And so he had a whole bunch of money, about $2,500 or something. And we went to the Ottawa Auditorium, and the ticket manager, where there was kind of a rival of my dad's, and they didn't get along very well, but he went up to the ticket manager and he said, "Give me $2,500 worth of tickets for the Old Timers game." And the guy was really happy to give them to him. And, he's selling tickets for the game. And then after my dad got all the tickets he could possibly get, he said, "The Rocket is coming," to rub it into the ticket manager. And so I can remember going to the game, and of course, the Rocket came. The place was sold out, the 7,000 tickets, which my dad scalped most of them, I guess, and he probably made several thousand on the deal. And I remember meeting the Rocket, and he was just great to me. And then I played old-timers hockey with the Rocket. The Rocket was a referee. I toured with the Montreal Old Pros all around the world. And him and I used to just sit in the front seats and talk about the old days. And so, I do go back a long time. There was guys coming to my house from the Hall of Fame. Bill Cowley, who played for Boston, and Cy Denny, Bill Durnan, that played Montreal. I played ball hockey out on the street with Bill Durnan. He was teaching me how to change my hands, because I don't know if people know that he used to catch with both hands. He had like trappers on both his hands, and when a guy would come down the left wing, he would put the stick in his left hand, and we come down the right wing, vice versa. So he taught me to do that. But when I got to play pro, then the gloves were different, and I wasn't able to do it. But I thought about trying it at one point, but the coaches wouldn't go for that. I used to do it in practice, but most of my coaches I didn't really get along with anyway, so you had to do what they said. But yes, I come from. My brother was a real good hockey player. He came up in the junior Canadians. He was in the Montreal system. I went to the Toronto system, and he was a great prospect for the Canadians. He played for the Hull Ottawa Canadians in juniors, the Brockville Canadians. They were in Brockville for a year. They had like the best junior team in Canada, guys like Bobby Russo and Jacques Laperriere and Billy Carter was a great player at the time, Normie Dennis. But anyway, Brian turned pro with the Hull Ottawa Canadiens, which was the top farm team from Montreal, and he had a great year his first year, his rookie year. He scored about 30 goals, and Montreal protected him. Those were in the days of only 6 teams, so they protected him so he couldn't go to another team. He wasn't available for the draft. But prior to that, he was in the playoffs, and I was at the game on a Good Friday. They were playing Kingston in the playoffs, and I was home from school at St. Mike's with my dad watching the game at Hull Arena, and he was hit. And it was days of no helmets, and the guy that hit him on Kingston was a guy named Terry Gray, and who played a little bit in the NHL for Detroit and I think Los Angeles.
Yes.
And anyway, he my brother went to the ice. He hit him in the head, and he went to the ice. He hit his head on the boards and the ice, and he was knocked out cold. And I remember my dad ran down and jumped on the ice with galoshes on and ran after Terry Gray to try and catch Terry Gray for suckering my brother.
Right.
And the whole arena was laughing and cowbells were ringing. And anyway, Sam Pollock, who was the legendary general manager of Montreal Canadiens, owned the team. And he was coaching for the Hull Ottawa Canadiens in the Central Hockey League, and so they weren't doing very well. Meanwhile, they brought my brother. They carried my brother off, and they put him in a cloakroom behind the dressing room where you would go and you'd change your clothes and your galoshes because there was a lot of snow out and stuff, and they just sat him there. And so we were in there with my brother. We were waiting for a doctor or something to come in, and Sam Pollock came in the room and started screaming at the team about they were losing and this and that. My dad went out to Sam Pollock, and he picked him up and threw him against the wall, and he said, "My son's dying in there. You get an ambulance here immediately."
Wow.
So I can remember Sam Pollock, who was like supposed to be the biggest guy in hockey, said, "Oh, I'm sorry, Des." And they went out and they got in the ambulance. So we went to the ambulance with my brother to the hospital. He almost died. He had a fractured skull. And the next year when he came back after being protected by Montreal Canadiens, so nobody else could get him, he wasn't the same player. And he never was the same player after that. He was meant to be a real good one.
Yeah, that's
a year later, Sam Pollock traded my brother Brian to Springfield Indians and Eddie Shore. So anybody that knows hockey, you know that was the last place that you wanted to go. And so my brother didn't go there, and he went over, played a few years in Europe, in Bern and in Switzerland, and had a great time. And then he wanted to play in the NHL, so he came back, and he had to go and play in Springfield. So then in Springfield, they forced Eddie Shore out of the game when expansion came to 12 teams, and then he was picked up with Los Angeles, and he played the first year for the Los Angeles Kings. But he was never the same after that as a hockey player. He was meant to be a real good hockey player.
Yeah,
just want to tell you that about my brother, and a little story about my brother, and a little story about my dad.
Now, that's an incredible story, but it had to be, for you as a brother, it had to be traumatic to watch all that unfold.
Yes, but I was proud of my dad running around the ice after the guy, and I was proud of what he did with Sam Pollock, who was Mr. Hockey at the time, and he saved my brother's life, otherwise he would have died. And so he went on, but I just wanted to let everyone know that he was meant to be a real good hockey player. He scored about 10 goals in the NHL, about 5 of them on me, and basically I was happy every time he scored on me.
That's understandable.
Never let him score. I guess he knew where to shoot on me.
That's right. Gary, you end up working your career through, as a young man through St. Michael's and end up with the Toronto Marlboros. That had to be a a big deal for you. Again, an Ottawa kid playing for the celebrated Toronto Marlboros team, and you've got a lot of characters, real good players, but also some very interesting characters, Mike Shaky Walton, Peter Stemkowski, Jim McKenney. Talk a little bit about the championship season Memorial Cup with the Toronto Marlboros.
Well, okay, but first I have to just talk about my career. There was a guy up the street that was a scout for Toronto. His name was Brian Lynch. He used to play for the Ottawa Rough Riders, and every day he would see me walking up the street in my pads up past his house and going to a rink in Ottawa, an outdoor rink with my goalie pads on. So he was watching me from a very early age. So the first team I ever played for was a team in Ottawa called the Woodruff Cardinals. And he used to come and watch us play, and so he told Toronto about me. So he took our team up to play a game on a Saturday morning that the Leafs were playing that night. So we drove up from Ottawa, and after that, we played the Marlboros midget team. I know it wouldn't have been, it was, I guess, midget, but we were like bantams, and they beat us like 17-0 or something like that. But after the game, they took me over to St. Mike's, and I didn't know what was going on, and they showed me the school. I was in grade 9 at home, and they said, "Would you like to come here next year to this school?" And I said, of course, get away from home when I'm like 14 years old and come to a place like that. So I went to St. Mike's the next year, and I flunked grade 9 at St. Pat's in Ottawa that year because I was just interested in playing hockey. But I told them that the scouts came to see me later on during the year, Punch Emlack and Bob Davidson, and they asked me how I was doing at school. I said I was doing great. I said I was on the honor roll. So anyway, next year I go to St. Mike's, and they put me in the brain class. And and then I was in grade 10, and I should have been in grade 9, and I ended up passing grade 10 because I got such good schooling at St. Mike's. But so I played at St. Mike's. At 14, I go there, and there's Davey Keon, Frank Mahovlich, Dick Duff, Les Duff, his brother, and all kinds of great guys that went on to the Hall of Fame, basically. And so you go there, and they treat you like you're supposed to be there. You're 14, they're 20. And
Wow.
also in goal at St. Mike's was Cesar Maniago. He was on Junior A. Jerry Cheevers was on Junior B. And I played in the midgets. And the first goalie glove that I ever got, Cesar Maniago gave me a baseball glove, a catching glove. And I had it until I got a better glove a couple of years later. And Jerry Cheevers, just the nicest guys you could ever meet. And they just treated you like they were your equal. And so that's where I came up. Then we had great championship teams in St. Mike's, Junior B, then Junior A. But what happened while I was there, Stafford Smythe, who owned the Toronto Maple Leafs, and they owned St. Mike's basically, and the Marlies, pulled away from the Ontario Hockey Association and formed their own league. And we had 6 teams in the league. There was St. Mike's, Marlies, Brampton, Whitby, Unionville, and somebody else, Oshawa. Oshawa, I guess. And anyway, we played their first year in St. Mike's, and then we played against Marlies in the playoffs. We beat them out. Then we won our league, and we played against Niagara Falls, who were the Ontario Hockey Association champions in the playoffs. And they beat us. Bernie Perront, Derek Sanderson, guys like that were playing. Gary Dornhofer were playing Terry Crisp for Niagara Falls. And they went out and they beat Edmonton in the Memorial Cup.
Right.
So the next year, Stafford Smythe, after 2 years, Stafford Smythe went back into the Ontario Hockey League with the Marlies. But in the meantime, at St. Mike's, we had moved to Neil McNeil because the guys weren't going to school as much as they should, and they weren't doing as well as they should. So St. Mike's stopped their junior hockey program. So they took the best players from St. Mike's and the best players from Marlboros to go into the Ontario Hockey League as the Marlies. So obviously we had a powerhouse. We had Stemkowski, Walton, as you mentioned, Jimmy McKinney, and we had over 10 players that ended up playing over 10 years in the National Hockey League, and we just ran away with the league. We were voted the best amateur team in Ontario in the 19th century. There's a lot of amateur teams in different sports in Ontario, and Toronto Marlboros were voted the number one amateur sport, amateur team in Ontario during the 1900s, which is quite an honor.
Absolutely.
Jim Gregory was our general manager. The other guys on the team, Nick Harbrook, Barry Watson, Ray DuPont, Rod Sealing, Gary Deneen, Mike Corbett, guys that went on to play good National Hockey League careers. Absolutely.
When your junior career ends, you obviously now come into the Toronto Maple Leafs system, in a system with the Leafs that's loaded with top-rated goaltenders. Terry Sawchuk, Johnny Bauer, Bruce Gamble's there, Al Smith is there. What's it like now for a young kid going into the Marlboros, going to the Maple Leafs training camp with that type of goaltending competition and the likes of guys you just mentioned, Dave Keon, Frank Mahovlich, George Armstrong, Tim Horton? It had to be an incredible experience.
Yes, Jerry Cheevers was also there at the time. So the goalies in the Leaf system at that time that I can remember, this was 65, around 1965. I think we won the Memorial Cup in 63, 64, so 65 or 64, 65. But they had, in Toronto, they had Johnny Bauer and Terry Sawchuk, Hall of Famers. In Rochester, they had Jerry Cheevers, Hall of Famer, Don Simmons in Tulsa, and a guy named Al Miller in Victoria. So basically, they signed me the same as they signed everybody for the same amount of money coming out of junior. It was $4,000 to sign, $5,000 for the first-year pro, and $5,500 the second-year pro. That's what everybody made, no matter if you're Davey Keon or Frank Mahovlich or anybody. Everybody made that. And so I signed with them, and I go there in training camp, and I got no chance of playing anywhere, really. So what they did is they sent me to Rochester and with Cheevers, and I was in Rochester most of the year. But when anyone would get hurt in Toronto, Victoria, BC, or Tulsa, then they would send me out there. So I ended up playing a few games for each of those teams, and the rest of the time I was in Rochester. I only got to play in one game in Rochester the whole year. Cheevers was so great, and it was the last game of the year when he got hurt with 5 minutes to go in the game, and I had to go and dress up. I wasn't sitting on the bench like you did, the goalies. Right. Just be in the stands, so they had to wait. They only had 5 games left to play in the season until I went in and put my stuff on and came out and played the last 5 games. Fortunately, I don't think they scored on me, but I did play a couple of games with the Leafs that year when Bauer and Sawchuk, one of them got hurt, and I was with Toronto most of the year, and they won the Stanley Cup that year. Like it was either with Rochester or Toronto or Victoria or Tulsa, but a lot of the time in Rochester, a lot of the time in Toronto, because Bauer and Sawchuk were so old that one of them was hurt most of the time. Right. And so I did get to play a couple of games, which was quite a good experience, and my first game was against the Rangers in Toronto. We lost 2-1. I can remember the winning goal went off Donnie Marshall's skate. He didn't mean to kick it in. It was a good goal, but it just went off his skate. But I played pretty well. Then the next game I played in Toronto against Montreal, which is kind of a famous game for me anyway. I was sitting on the bench this time. They dressed me for some reason, and it was probably one of the first goalies ever to sit on a bench. Because I guess they figured that I know Sawchuk was playing, and he was a little doubtful that he was going to make it. through the game. So there was a fight right in front of our bench, John Ferguson and Eddie Shack. So I wanted to be part of the team, and so it was right in front of me, sitting on the bench. So I was yelling at Ferguson, and in the first period, and we were losing 1-0, I think. And so anyway, Punch Imlach heard me yelling at him, and he took the towel off my neck, my shoulders, sitting on the bench, and he said, "You're going in the net, get Ferguson." So I said to him, "Well, how can I get him? He's in the penalty box." He said, "Get him when he gets out." So I said, "Oh, okay." So they put me in the net, and they scored a couple of goals on me, and it was getting near the end of the first period, and Ferguson was still in the penalty box. And so I figured, I'm never going to play another game in the NHL. What should I do to try and make people remember me? So I said, I'm going to go and try to myself. I'm going to go try and score, or at least get an assist. So somehow the puck ended up in my glove, and I took a couple of steps, and I was by everybody, and I dropped the puck. And I only had one guy to beat, and it was J.C. Tremblay, who never hit a guy in his life. So I went and I tried to put a move on him at the Canadiens' blue line, and he hit me, and I went spinning around, and I could see Ralph Backstrom going the other way on my first spin on a breakaway with only Marcel Pronovost back. And on that spin, I saw Punch Imlach pull his hat down over his head. And then on the second spin, I saw Marcel Pronovost make the greatest save I've ever seen in my life, stopping Backstrom. And as I scurried back to the net, I fell down a couple of times. The whole Montreal Forum was just laughing their pants off. And I got back in there, and then it turns out the whole arena would just buzz for the rest of the game. And they changed the rule the next day that a goaltender can't go by the blue line, and they sent me back down to the minors to Victoria. I was there the next day. Well, anyway, I was pretty famous at the time, and so I tried it a lot. And I remember when I was in Victoria, I played in a game, and I was making plays. I was going up and doing that. They were in the Western Hockey League, and I was just waiting till the forwards, I had the puck in my glove till the forwards got by me. I'd drop the puck, and the guys would go, and I could make some pretty good passes. I remember a guy named Millie Marcetta got 5 goals one game for Victoria, and the headlines in the paper the next day were, Smith gets 4 assists, Marcetta 5 goals. And so it became my trademark for a while, and I tried until the game got too fast, and I got too old, and I couldn't do it anymore.
It's funny you mentioned that about J.C. Tremblay. Not a physical player, but a very good one, and then he didn't want to be embarrassed by a goaltender, I guess, so I'm the
only guy he ever hit.
Yeah,
but
exactly.
Probably wasn't very hard to hit. But on the road trip to Montreal that day, I was replacing Johnny Bauer, and we took a train. It was like, I guess we played the night before, and we took a train to Montreal from Toronto. And he asked me about Tim Horton, and in those days, we had one railroad car to ourselves, and they had upper and lower bunks, and guys would have a few beers at the end of it, and at one end, and the management would be on the other end. And the goaltenders, because they were goalies, got the bottom berths. And so we had a couple beers after the game, and then we all went to bed about 1 o'clock. We all left at the same time to go to bed. And meanwhile, the train is traveling from Toronto to Montreal. And so Tim Horton was supposed to be above Johnny Bauer, and I was replacing Bauer. And so I got there and with Tim, and I said, I'll go up on top because, I'm a rookie, and this is Tim Horton. And he says, no way. He says, you're a goalie, and this is where you're going to sleep. Wow. And so Tim Horton crawled over me and crawled up to the top bunk after having played a really tough game, and he was tough as nails. And I imagine his body was pretty sore, and it wasn't that easy for him to get up to the top bunk. And here I was sleeping in the bottom bunk. I couldn't sleep all night, but anyway, that's the way the guys were in those days. They were one for another, and it was a big family to them. And playing with Toronto Maple Leafs, Frank Mahovlich, guys like that, just treated me like I belonged to be on the team. Yet I was like a rookie. I hadn't even played any games pro hardly, you know.
Mm-hmm. In that time period when you're earning that nickname Suitcase because of the 4 minor league teams and your fill-in role, as you mentioned, you play a lot with Rochester and with a teammate defenseman, Don Cherry. What are your recollections of Don Grapes Cherry?
Well, first of all, just a great guy. I played with him the first year. My second year pro, I played with him again, and that year I played a lot. I played with Bobby Perro as the other goalie, and I played like 25 or 30 games. And with Cherry, he was a great defenseman. He was tough as nails. He wasn't a very good skater. And he wasn't a great playmaker, but he's a great defensive player. I can remember that in those days, most of the teams traveled by bus. We were fortunate enough to travel by plane, but the plane was god-awful. It was a DC-3 plane that was used during the war, and it was already 25 years old, and we had some flights that were just knuckle busting, and but I remember Joe Crozier would give us 2 beers, each player 2 beers a game after a game when we go on the road. As you came on the plane, he'd be at the front. He'd hand us 2 beers, and I remember Don Cherry used to give Mike Walton and I one of his beers, one each. And so he has the reputation of being a big drinker, everything. He's not a big drinker at all. He is just the greatest guy, greatest teammate you could ever have. And he looked after us guys. I'll tell you a story about him one night. We had a guy, a real tough guy on our team named Norm Armstrong. Mm-hmm. And we played in, I think, Baltimore one night, and so we flew from Baltimore to Springfield, where the previous mentioned Eddie Shore's team was. We were playing Springfield the next day, and it was New Year's Eve, and we got into the hotel. I think it was called the Sheraton Hotel in Springfield, and we got in there, and I was rooming with Jimmy Pappin, and across from our room there was a party, a New Year's Eve party. And we went in there, and Normie Armstrong saw what was going on in the party, and he went in and he stole the salad bowl out of the party and ran into our room right across from the party and slammed the door. And some guys were coming and chasing him from the party. And so anyway, Pappin and I are in there, and Red is in there with his salad bowl with salad in it, and we didn't know what he did. And he just came in the same time we did, and laughing. He was laughing. And so they were kicking in the doors, the people from this party, trying to get at this. He said, "This red-headed so-and-so, we saw you take that bowl and came in here." Excuse me, I got to move inside. The lawnmower's coming by. Anyway, we didn't know what was on the other side of the door, guys banging on the door, saying, you so-and-so's, get out here, we're going to kick the crap out of you. And Red Armstrong could kick the crap out of anybody. So anyway, I called Don Cherry's room, and I said, Grapes, I says, we might need some help out here. We don't know what's on the other side of this door. And because we couldn't get the door open from our side, and they couldn't get it open from their side because it was kicked in so bad. Mm-hmm. So anyway, next thing we know, there's a knock on the door, and it's Don Cherry, and he says, "Axe," he said, "slide the key under the door." And I said, I said, "Well, do you think it's safe?" He said, "What do you think I'm trying to open the door for?" It was very safe. So Don Cherry opened the door from the outside, and in come these guys, and they said, they took a look at Red Armstrong and Jimmy Pappin and me and Don Cherry, and they said, I'm sorry, you just keep the salad.
A wise decision.
Don Cherry was great, and then he went on to be. He used to have Mike Walton and Terry Clancy and myself and Stemmer over at his house for dinner, and with his wife Rose and his dog Blue. He's had about 5 or 6 of these dogs, Blue, because they pass away. He just buys another one. They look exactly the same. Mm-hmm. And his big thing was to watch at that time was he had a nice aquarium, and he'd sit there and he'd sip on a beer and he'd watch the fish swim around. And he basically got paid, like the rest of us, about $6,000, and then he would work in a car dealership during the summer. A very hard worker and a good supporter of his family, great. And then, so he got to be known in Rochester, and then when he finished playing hockey, they made him a coach. And so then he was a coach for Rochester for several years. I think he won a couple of Calder Cups. And then he got the job in Boston, and Bobby Orr came along,
right,
just as he got the job. So it was, match made in heaven, of course. And then he went on, and after they fired, like everybody gets fired, so he ended up with a gig on TV, and the rest is history.
Absolutely, and your story explains a lot of why he's so popular with the players, the ex-players you talk to now. As I noted to you last time we talked, I work with the Bruins alumni, and you talked to those guys who played for him, O'Reilly, Middleton, etc. And there's still a very strong bond there, to be sure. Yeah,
he came at the right time as far as the Boston coaching establishment was, where they had Cheevers and Bobby Orr and Johnny Busey, just a great team, So when you're winning, it helps promote a lot of things. And like myself, I didn't get along with my coaches very well, and because you're losing all the time. And most of the teams I played for, but Boston was a great situation for him, and the alumni of Boston, I know all the guys are great guys, and I actually, something that nobody knows, my first year pro that I talked about when I was moving around a lot, Boston only had 3 goaltenders in their whole organization. One of them was Eddie Johnson, one of them was Jack Norris, and I don't know who the other goaltender was. Cheevers wasn't there yet. But Punch Imlach made a deal for me to go to Boston and practice with Boston all the time, starting in about March of my first year pro. And so Boston, Milt Schmidt was the coach, and they were in last place, and they only had one goalie. And so in case he got hurt, then I would have to play. And but they needed somebody for practice, so they let me to Boston for a year.
Wow!
Or for the rest of the year. So it was March, April, and then whenever the season ends, maybe it was sometime in February. But so I traveled with them. I practiced with the Bruins, and on the team at that time, Eddie Johnson was the goalie, but he was with a broken arm. He was out for the year. And Jack Norris was the guy that was playing. And I didn't realize till 50 years later, there was an article in the Toronto Star about me going there, and the deal was for $1, they would lend me there, and then I got an NHL salary, of course, which was like a $2,000 raise for me, prorated till the end of the year. And but I didn't realize till 50 years later that if I were to play, if I had to play, then the Leafs were going to get Johnny Busick for me playing. And so there was no way that Boston was going to be playing me. And I was wondering, Milt Schmidt was such a great guy. They were doing so brutal with this guy Jack Norris in the net. Why not give me a chance? And I was wondering why he never put me in there. And he was a good friend of my dad's, and he was so nice to me and everything. And but they never put me in. They went with Jack Norris for the whole time. But I didn't realize till 50 years later that if I had played, that Johnny Busick was coming to Toronto. And certainly for the Boston Bruins, it was a good thing I never played.
Yeah, certainly would have changed history for the Bruins and for yourself, to be sure. That's great Bruins trivia. I never knew that.
Yes, and also they would put my name in the lineup when I went on the road, and I guess at home. And but I read the program once, and you know what number they gave me? I was on, but I never wore. I never even saw the sweater. Mm-hmm. Number 4.
Wow.
So I guess basically I was number 4 before Bobby Orr was number 4.
Well, that's two things I never knew before that our fans will love to hear too.
So the next year, I was hoping, I really tried hard in practice, and I behaved myself, and Milt Schmidt was my coach, great friend of my dad's, and next year I was hoping to get drafted by them. And guess who they drafted?
I mean, that must have been Jerry Cheevers that year, right?
Cheevers. So that was another good thing for Boston. They didn't draft me. But I was hoping to get drafted there, and they took Cheevers. So then I went to Rochester, and I was regular goalie. I played I don't know how many games, 60 games or something that year when Cheevers left.
Yeah, it would have been a different turn in your career because you played with some teams. We're going to get to that in a second. But if you had Bobby Orr in front of you with Espo and Busick, Cashman, Hodge, etc., you probably would have
helped. But I wasn't as good as Cheevers was anyway. But it sure would have. There's funny twists and things, and whatever is meant to be is meant to be, and. It sure would have been great for me. But Jerry Cheever is one of my greatest friends, and I'm happy for him. So I'm happy with my career and happy for Jerry and the great career that he had.
Your career takes a turn. You go from the championship Toronto Maple Leafs organization. NHL expands, which provides opportunities for players like yourself with NHL caliber, but obviously you're not going to leapfrog over 5 players in Toronto as a young player in goal. The Oakland Seals draft you. You go out there. Charlie Hodge is also drafted, so you're strong in goal. You're playing for even by those days standards, as I recall, Bert Olmsted, who was eventually a Hall of Famer, former Montreal Canadian, kind of a hard-nosed coach. What was that first year like in Oakland, California?
Well, first of all, I was happy to be drafted by Oakland. I'm a kid from Canada going to San Francisco area, and it was good. We lost all the time. I think that, as you mentioned, our coach was Bert Olmsted, and he was just too tough. He was a real old school coach and player, but as a coach, he just wasn't meant to be a coach. He was too strict. I can remember a practice, we hadn't even had a game yet in the NHL, and we were called an NHL team, the Oakland Seals, and we played an exhibition game in Port Huron, Michigan, against Buffalo of the Buffalo Bisons, I guess it was called, of the American Hockey League. And I played in the American Hockey League the year before, and they were a good team, but they just weren't an NHL team. And here we were an NHL expansion team, and Bert Olmsted figured we were supposed to beat them, and we tied them 3-3. And he came in the dressing room after, and he said, if I were you guys, I would go right home and go to bed because you're going to have a practice tomorrow like you've never had in your life. So I think everybody probably went out and and didn't bother going to bed. I'm sure I know I went out. And anyway, the next day we go to practice, and he blows a whistle and he says, "Go to the sideboard, stops and starts." We had to go skate from one side to the other and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth and back and forth. And there was a clock in the arena, and after about 3 minutes of this, you've had it. Mm-hmm. And everybody's had it. So the guys are barfing. The ice is worn out for the guys stopping and starting on it, both sides of the boards. And we look at the clock, and he blows the whistle, and it's been an hour. He says, "You're halfway there." So we had to do that for another hour.
Oh.
And I think that at that time in training camp, the spark from the team was just taken right out of the team. And so on any other team, I went from, we won the championship 3 years in Rochester. We won the Memorial Cup before that. Every team I'd ever played on had won everything in the season, and we went to being the worst team in hockey. And it was because the heart was just taken out of the team. There was a bunch of great guys and good hockey players, and we'd go out after the game, and it was all about the coach, how much we hated the coach, the guys that just go drinking, or we'd play golf, and we hated the coach. We didn't even think about even trying to win. We just wanted him to get out of there, basically.
Right. Well, nonetheless, the next season in 68-69, you do get a chance to become the consistent starting goaltender. You have 4 shutouts. I was curious if you recall a game on Christmas of 1968 in Boston, a 3-1 victory over the powerful Boston Bruins, the team that the Seals would have struggled with historically, but you had a big night that night with 37 saves, I believe. Do you recall that game on Christmas of 68?
No, not at all.
Well, we do in Boston anyway. So eventually, you're playing well with the Seals, as you noted. The team has its ups and downs with Coach Freddie Glover. Eventually, Charlie Finley comes onto the scene and takes over control of the team as an owner. And I'm curious of your recollections of Charlie Finley.
Yeah, Charlie Finley was great. We didn't see him very often, but he would see us in places like Boston or Chicago or Detroit, the old arenas, and he knew nothing about hockey. I remember he had a guy named Harvey Wittenberg, who is now, I think, still the voice of the Chicago Blackhawks at the arena. Maybe he's not anymore, but he was for many years. But he was our announcer. They got the games on the radio, strictly so Charlie Finley could hear the games. And I guess he'd go to sleep at night listening to Harvey and broadcasting the Seals games. But he would bring his buddies to the games, and if we happened to win a game on the road somewhere, he would come into the dressing room after and give us all $300 and say, go buy a pair of shoes or go buy a suit or something like that. And the only thing he was, like, we traveled first class with Charlie. We after I left, they had their own plane, I understand, but the only thing he wouldn't do is he wouldn't pay his players. And so when my contract came up with the Seals, he wouldn't get. I had played like 72 games in the season, and I think at that time I was making $30,000. Mm-hmm. And he wanted, because I lost the most games in the league, and I won the most games in the league, and I tied the most games in the league. But because I lost, he wanted to give me a $7,000 cut in pay. So he wanted to give me $23,000 instead of $30,000, and I played 72 games.
Wow.
And this lawnmower is coming back. And so I went to arbitration, and that time the judge for the arbitration was a guy named Ed Houston from Ottawa. And so I went to arbitration in Ottawa, and I got my cousin, who is a guy that played in the CFL and university grad. He was Jim Kane's his name. He was my guy that I went to arbitration for. And so Judge Houston rules that Finley is right. I should get $23,000 the next year. Ooh. So I say, great. And I got the call. The next day I got a call, and I'd just been traded to Chicago for 4 players. Jerry Desjardins, Jerry Pinder, Paul Schmier, and a guy named Kerry Bond, who I don't know who he was. Mm-hmm. I got traded the next day after my contract was settled by arbitration. And that's how I ended up in Chicago. But as far as Charlie Finley, he was great with everything, but he wouldn't pay his players. That's why in a couple of years after that, Gilles Meloche, that year, Gilles Meloche ended up going for Jerry Desjardins. Jerry Desjardins came back to the Blackhawks, and Gilles Meloche went to that team and made him an instant contender because he's a fantastic goalie. But that's why all the guys, Charlie Finley, all the guys jumped from the Seals. There must have been 7 or 8 of them, Bobby Sheehan, and Gilles was the only one that stuck there because he had to play Gilles. That was all he had. He had to pay Gilles. That was all he had. But that's why the Oakland Seals struggled for the years after that, is because they all jumped to the WHA because he wouldn't pay them.
Yeah, they lost 11 guys that year. You mentioned Paul Schmier had left, Jerry Pinder, and Norm Ferguson, Bobby Sheehan, Wayne Carlton. You go on, but the team was starting to come together by that time, and everybody, as you said, Charlie was reluctant to pay them, and they all departed. But prior to that, I want to talk about, you just noted that 70-71 season where you play 72 games, and I read somewhere that at the end of the season, you were so mentally and physically exhausted, you actually had to be hospitalized. Is that correct?
I didn't have to be hospitalized, but I was mentally exhausted. Totally. My wife and I drove back to Ottawa and from San Francisco, and I was in the back seat the whole way, blowing in a bag because I was so screwed up. And so that summer, before Chicago made the deal, I didn't. I was sent. Charlie Finley sent me to Chicago for a medical assessment. So I went to a doctor in Chicago, and believe me, I had a terrible summer after. I was just physically exhausted and mentally, mostly mentally screwed up because of the losing situation and having to play all those games. And so anyway, I went to this doctor in Chicago, and he went through all these tests and stuff like that. And then so he said, well, and I told him how brutal it was, how tough it was losing all the time and playing all the time in Oakland and that. And I can remember him saying to me, well, he couldn't tell me that I was going to be traded, but it was, I was traded like a month later after they found out there was nothing the matter with me. But I understood it was Finley sending me to Chicago, and it, I guess, was Chicago and Finley sending me there and giving me a physical to see if I was capable of playing. Because when I went to Chicago, I remember if we were going on the road, I would have to be at the airport like 2 hours before we left because I wanted to make sure I was there and I was going to be on the plane because I was too screwed up because I didn't think that I could even make the plane. And everybody was asking me, what's the matter with you? Like Stan Mikita, I can remember him saying to me, what's the matter with you? And I said, I don't know, I'm just so nervous. Basically, I think I'm going to die today. And he said, I have the same feeling. He said, you know what? He said, you know what? I lost my hair because I was so nervous about things. So he said, just have a couple of beers and you'll be all right. So basically, that was the best advice I ever got in my life.
Yeah, least expensive therapy you can get, I guess. But I was going to, before we leave the Seals, I wanted to ask you about two players who are no longer with us, who were a very prominent part of that Seals team. Number one was Harry Howell, of course, Norris Trophy winner, Hockey Hall of Famer. Towards the end of his career, of course, at that point, what are your memories of Harry Howell?
Maybe the greatest guy that ever lived. Nicest guy that ever lived, a great defenseman, just such a gentleman. Harry and I became great friends. I used to play golf with him every day, and during the season when we were at home with Carol Vadnais and Harry, myself, and Normie Ferguson. And Harry and I had a joke, and we would just say that we were opposition going into to play these other teams, and that's all we were, as the opposition. We were like the Washington Generals basketball team playing against the Globetrotters. We used to just look at each other and just say, well, if there was a big crowd or something, well, it looks like they like the opposition today. We knew we were going to lose, basically, but we do our best not to lose. Mm-hmm. And just a gentleman and great guy, and used to see Harry. He was scouting for Minnesota North Stars for many years.
Right.
And we'd, whenever he was scouting and I was still playing on a team, then we'd go out to dinner and miss him dearly.
Yeah, he's a very nice guy. I had a chance to meet him. As you said, he was a scout. And so when I was working in Hartford, he'd come into town and get a chance to meet him a couple of times. Very, very nice man. And another player that you just mentioned, who was the All-Star player of the Seals, a defenseman, came over from the Montreal organization, Carol Vadnais. What are your recollections of Carol as a player and as a person?
Well, he made us a half-decent team when he came. I think it was the second year, and we had a big turnaround with the Freddie Glover year. And a great guy. He was just talented person. Could just move the puck. He could skate through the team himself, and just a great guy. And as a person, he was tough. I can remember him having I think 3 fights in one game with Keith Magnuson, who was another great guy and great team player. And he'd stand up for his teammates, and he was gone. And then he went to Boston, and he fit in pretty good there. I think he was I think he was in the Stanley Cup team. I'm not sure. He was, yeah, good. And he made the team a bit of a threat. And that's where we had Normie Ferguson, that great year that he had. When I was rooming with Normie, he got, I don't know how many goals, 35, 40 goals, and he tied with Danny Grant in scoring. And Danny was voted Rookie of the Year, and of course, nothing against Danny, but the guys with Oakland figured that Fergie should have been the Rookie of the Year. But no, the voters for the Rookie of the Year from the NHL press or something, and we were playing out in Oakland, and our games were on TV, and they never saw him. Danny Grant was playing in Minnesota. I don't think they saw him either, but they picked Danny over Fergie, but we figured Fergie should have deserved it to be rookie, and he was another big factor in ourselves having a good year. We went from last place, like worst in the league, and we made the playoffs. I think we were close to first place the next year.
We hope you enjoyed part 1 of our interview with Gary Smith. Part 2 will be coming up soon, and we'll talk about Gary's days with the Chicago Blackhawks, where he reveals how he really felt about goaltending tandem mate and future Hall of Famer Tony Esposito. And we've got just absolutely crazy stories about his days in Minnesota, Washington, and in the WHA with the Winnipeg Jets. Either way, great guy, great stories, and we hope you join us for part 2 of our interview with Gary Suitcase Smith. Remember, home base for the show is prohockeyalumni.org, and you can also reach us anywhere on social media at ProHockeyAlumni. Your comments, ratings, and reviews on iTunes are extremely valuable in increasing the visibility of the show. I read all your comments, and they are greatly appreciated. Now, let's talk classic hockey with Gary Smith.